Hello and welcome to all those with us here today and on live stream. My name is Alice Butler. I am the Centre for American Art Postdoc Fellow, and I am so happy and honoured to welcome you to the Courtauld in partnership with the Centre. Thank you for being with us today, and I would like to extend a special thank you to Sophie Seita, a writer, artist and thinker whom I have long admired, for sharing your work with us this evening. This evening's lecture by Sophie, Decals of Love or The One True Imposter, a lyric lecture with through some queer love poems, is part of an event series on correspondence in feminist art, art writing and art history that I've been organising this year. And we had an amazing, really rich workshop with Sophie just a few hours ago. Recognising the contribution feminist and queer artists and writers have made to transforming the once private, domestic tradition of letter writing, this series approaches the critical object of correspondence expansively, encompassing the performative, the literary, the visual, the affective and the figurative, correspondence as letters, communications, networks, also as relations, affects, associations, connections, affinities, replies. And we're thinking of replies in quite an expansive sense. What can this turn to correspondence, we ask? Its entanglement with letters, its holding of association and ambivalence, do the methods of feminist art historical research? And how can taking risks with literary form, like the writing of a letter that is also a hazard, to steal Emily Dickinson's description that she penciled onto the unfolded pattern of an envelope, open out new ways of taking risks with content? Such questions have been motivated by the capacious research and practice of Sophie Seita, whom it is my pleasure to introduce as our speaker this evening. In my thinking with correspondence as a queer feminist methodology, I have been inspired by Sophie's work, which both studies and practices expanding definitions of theory and history through an attention to form and performance, the live, the literary live letter, the always in between, complex modes of hospitality, collaboration, dialogue, care, eros, pleasure, of being and writing and learning with queer subjects and communities across time, of mobilising the imaginative pull of solidarity and correspondence, even when uneasy or unfinished or paranoid, as an effective sustaining reparative force in the present. Sophie Seita challenges us to think and rethink the complexities of the address. That is how we address our subjects, the marginalised, the neglected, the edgewise of history, also the too close correspondent, as intellectual kin, without smoothing over difference, difficulty, ambivalence and risk, the temporal drag of distance. As Seita has responded in a recent published conversation, returning to older works can both be a resistance strategy, resisting a particular narrative or mode of working, and it can be a lifeline that forges new creative partnerships. So in this way, it can be both. Seita's multimedia transdisciplinary works are complex and careful events of literary and embodied and gestural translation, calling to mind the etymology of the term as a state of being carried over across language, bodies, spaces, temporalities, disciplines, mediums, genres, which connects with the transference or the translocation of a love letter to a dead or living writer, artist, kin. It recalls movement, materiality and intimacy. It is never one voice, like correspondence between friends or writers. In the 2021 film Cloudiness, Seita writes in proximity to Mina Loy, Lisa Robertson and Sarah Ahmed when she considers what she terms the tactility of translation, its harbouring of touch. As we feel the word's edges, listen for worlds. It is bodily, also affective, also spatial, this mode of touching, feeling, listening, writing. Playing with words like clay, Sophie Seita, your name in the nearby of the parenthetic hold. Sophie Seita is a London-based artist, writer and educator whose work explores text in its various translations into book objects, performances, videos or other languages and embodiments. She works internationally on several creative and critical projects, Most recently, and together with Naomi Wu, she's co-created a performance and community-oriented public art project rooted in speculative and collaborative research on queer feminist gardeners. Other work has been shown at Space, La Mama Gallery, Printed Matter, Bold Tendency, the RA, the Serpentine, Queer Art Projects, and elsewhere. She is an assistant professor at Boston University, co-organises the interdisciplinary sound text seminar at Harvard, and is a visiting tutor on the alternative education programme at Rupa in Vilnius, Lithuania, and the MST in Writing for Performance at Cambridge University. Her monograph, Provisional Avant-Gardes, the Little Magazine Communities from Dada to Digital, was published by Stanford University Press in 2019. At the moment, she's working on a book of experimental essays titled Lessons of Decal, a book on performance art called Literary Live Art, a translation of Aldana Wolf's etymological gossip forthcoming with Nightboat, and various performances and collaborations. More info on her performances, publications and other projects can be found on her website. In correspondence and gratitude with pleasure, please join me in welcoming Sophie Seita.
Thank you so much, Alice. Such a generous introduction. So what I'm going to do is talk to you or read to you for about 45 to 50 minutes, and my recommendation would be to really let the language wash over you. There might be moments, obviously, you want to listen closely, but I think there's also an interest in... Come on.
I had to do a head count, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, okay, no, that's okay.
Sorry to disturb you.
I like interruptions. So to kind of think of these different forms maybe of listening, or how we listen to poetry, and I call this a lyric lecture, and we can talk a little bit more about this maybe in the Q&A, how I would define it, or maybe define it, or how compare it to the lecture performance, but also how it's its own form. But I'm really thinking of this as a kind of, what I'm demonstrating as a kind of dialogic criticism, where poetry is used as an argument, or citation is used or is put side by side on the page, sometimes with very little mediation by me as a reader. I think there are also performative elements, just in the sense of performative utterances without necessarily a kind of performative embodiment. But yeah, I'm interested in thinking through these issues. So I'll start. I'm just going to see if this works perfectly. Great. Forms of address. Dear Wendy, I'm twirling like a leaf in the wind, feeling all the rich red and orange and burnt open, and even grey suddenly seems like an interesting colour. I'm soaking it all up. Wish me luck that my emotional quandaries will somehow magically resolve themselves. Love poem A. Definitions, just like descriptions, aim for greater and greater precision, encircling the object until it can be captured. They aim for clarity, for a demarcation of outlines or limits. In this attempt, they are a roundabout way of figuring out suitable forms of address. In the magazine On Contemporary Practice, dedicated to discussions of one's contemporaries, Tom Donovan and Michael Cross pitched their editorial model as motivated by desire, friendship, socio-political commitment, and discourse among one's communities and peers. It's a motivation that leads to a question about form. Quote, can we observe a present while it is still occurring, that is, before it has ossified into events consigned to a representative past? I've written elsewhere about the movable contemporaneity of provisional avant-garde communities. Some writing might originate, commence in one time, but only gain traction in another. Sometimes poems speak directly to a contemporary sensibility, aesthetic form, or content, but poems without these thematic markers aren't necessarily less contemporary. poems can firmly be lodged in our contemporary frames of reference or run against them, transforming them along the way. So this lyric lecture deals with the indentations on the surface of our contemporary moment, or my contemporary moment, made by the poems of the American poet Wendy Lotterman. Following the contours, I will read Lotterman's work closely but also lovingly. I love these poems. I'm enamored with them. This essay is my attempt to make sense of my infatuation with Lotterman's words. For a while now, some literary critics have suggested that critique isn't the only form of writing our literary works could take. Critique, as we have come to know it in close readings, for example, usually proceeds by a response that follows the formula, on the surface, X looks like this, but really, if you lift the lid, tweak open the closet, the true meaning will be revealed. Or it produces a slipshod cataloguing of formal features pointing everywhere and nowhere. At its best, however, close reading can be a thinking with and alongside, in delightful entanglement, thus staying true to the text's spirit, but also taking it as an occasion for going elsewhere. Love poems, in their simplest definitions, are poems inspired by, or in some obstinately stochastic way about love in all its multiple forms and addresses and conceptual caresses. I put about in quote marks because I'm interested in prepositions, the work they can do. Love poems exist around or near a loved object. They're approximating it impatiently or perhaps somewhat hesitantly. But love poems aren't just inspired by love, they can inspire love in return. I'm going to be talking about both of these directions and relations, their allure, their transactions. Performatives like I love you are speech acts that often occur in transactional situations, easily tested by the addition of a hereby. I hereby order you to do this. I hereby arrest you. I'm arrested by these poems, which is a form of love. And love is a performance artist who can't get enough attention, who demands a response, like a decoy. It's rather awkward to declare love and not receive a response. So Wendy Lotterman's poems have called out their love, and I shall answer their calling. They weren't written for or about me, but I am, for the purposes of this lecture and my life, claiming them for myself. And this is a key feature of the love poem as much as the love song. We want to make it ours. I will now read to you one of Lotterman's poems in its entirety. A poem which I have made my own, and I will then proceed to use her words to present my case, my encomium, at Plato's notable banquet. Tie. The game cannot end in a tie, you say, as 2 tears streak down each of your cheeks. A penalty kicks out the window, killing one of 2 twins, leaving the other to receive her love in doubles. What comes next? Freebasing, hypertension, and soft pretzels as sudden death parts our hair in the middle, and we find this absolutely spectacular. The way an answer comes forth from the woods. In the video, we disappear back into the iridescent leaflet of original suspense, reimbursing the worst of what's kept to the breast. But sex is not a mother unable to pick which kid she loves more. One twin always dies, since the game cannot end in a tie. 2 skies sitting in a tree, sequencing love and contract. 2 trees rejecting the room, fucking beneath the sky. Skies indifferent to that difference between 1 and 2, and 2 times you tell me that one team has to win, halving your cake as evidence of pleasure in domestic measures, and tan lines scrawled across your frosted hips, split in 2 even scenes of beauty, with bouncers announcing the border. The erotic trespass expires by the time it's safe to cross. In the yard, privates collide with wine and Scrabble as I contemplate the single silicone dome they emptied on the belt at security. How to keep this in perspective? Myself, inadmissible to that love or what happens on each side of the border. I find it absolutely intolerable not to be in your bed, relaxing diaphragms and freebasing our inseparable futures. I find it intolerable. Grieving the national imperative to win, make rank, and identify are what TV calls victory and textbooks call healthy development. But I would enter you both until genealogy inverted, if such love were an appropriate taste. Sex and cat toys punctuate the open concept honesty of first nights at sea, with the fluency of decoys that don't get homesick. I got lonely, cried in church, went to a concept hospital for only hair and nails. Sionskirche falls in and out of relation, but only as long as you think it, that this can and can't go on forever, that you do and don't want this to go on forever, that you are safe on planes, in the bathroom, imprisoned, asleep, but that it is better to be outside, beyond the idea of your secret interior. Banks break, wives break and begin again with a contract that assimilates the doubt. The right reasons rain down like documented angels with the safety of love and statistically good looks. Your little Rose wakes up in Stella Luna's fleece with the epistemology of horse girls gone wild. Her fruit leather face, their zero sibilance policy, the tribal-style corona locks lips with the dream of a child who knows what she wants before the die sets. A freezed-out lucidity of basic instinct mixed with a minimum of fear. The nightly tinnitus finds its way into your life, into a locket between our breasts in the bedroom where a shag rug declares the space between girlhood and universality. Nipples touch the arch of your foot before your weight creates a prepubescent girl. A key to that room is etched on a single grain of rice that floats insensibly inside a vial on your chest, bobbing with your body in the water. There is a limited amount of faces that you can remember, but the diaphragm still tries to expand. Sudden death parts life in two scenes of less and excess. Why I love you specifically, and why I can't cry for Argentina. I squeezed my thighs tight so I wouldn't fall off. Like most protests, the bruise will drain and then return to stasis. Feeling redistributes on the left, so that holidays on your hip are spent without gifts. It isn't too late. You're not behind because you choose what I chose a long time ago, and shame is not a baby in our hand-me-down bassinet. Your dreams turn sweet and then uncomfortably sour as sudden death drafts two teams of unequal need. It's too soon to give up. A golf ball-sized polyp moves into view as I reason that it is too soon to give up. No to this and all other metaphoric volumes arresting the underdog's wire coat momentum, like an internalized doorstop lodged in the joint birthday of desire. Life is a bottom. Only I can take the wind out of my sockets and trade gummies for head in the underwater playroom. I find you there, in a bullseye of kindness between fir trees and mowed-out rings of concentric tenderness. You are soft and resonant. Your twin leaves the party before you can do the same. Come out bearing the shape of the house that you came from. Arrive the diner rarefied by light years of desire. Metaphoric volumes of moss will roll out, red hot along the lava beside the road. There is a limited amount of faces you can remember. There is a secret you don't yet know how to confess. You close both eyes, redistributing ghosts to the perimeter of your sensory kingdom. Skies divide, the bed dissolves like Dippin' Dots. I find you there in rings of concentric threat where the truth produced two wings of equal size. There is a limited amount of faces. I love you specifically. The game cannot end in a tie, but you are paralyzed by indivisible desire and terrified by the loss of every side. A tie is a knot. Things get stuck. Is post-shag rug adulthood equivalent to the universal and the homogeneous? Love poems which depend on the universal for their appeal to the reader simultaneously depend on the specificity of the lover. Wendy Lotterman's poems are not universal. The universal kicks around as a ghost and causes a fuss, or is it the specific, the specificity of you as in you, babe? I love you specifically, but perhaps you are also a lesser proxy of my mother in this replicable nursery. You sub in as an exit strategy. But people and situations aren't metaphors or instruments. They can be read both as symbolic and absolutely singular, which is the core of what constitutes an acute crisis in these poems. Full of ferocious frustration, something always remains unconsummated, unrealized. The erotic trespass expires by the time it's safe to cross. Where lanyard grants access to the gardens is also where possibility lays flayed before our separate reservations as range of motion invites the body to corroborate. And will it? Passes expire. The lanyard might promise a garden of earthly delights, but it needs to be used at the right time, otherwise ingress deletes the actual arcade. Or by entering, you undo the very idea of entrance and thus kill the mystery. Maybe you feel desire needs boundaries to flourish. There is a password for the party. It's the crevice where histamine brings your body into knowledge, if you let it. The crevice is a hidden or unknown or unenterable space that tickles or threatens you with an allergic reaction, an automatic, impulsive response. Desire can endure delay only so long. Eventually, you need to act. You swear by the rate of exchange and the temperature of two legs that must finally be put to bed, that must finally put the subject to bed. The subject matter or the lover. You can't decide, so you return to the obsessive Vitruvian escape room. Hooked by mathematically perfect proportions, idealized and therefore also indecipherable. I can't tell what the rivulets of impossibly soft access are saying, but I get it. The speaker makes a decision and then questions it again, sequencing love and contract or contract, depending on where you put the stress. No, you cannot get back into the same bed you left. The real non-transferable ticket is you. Lotterman's poems are full of dualisms. One poem describes the binary siren of your nostrils. Tai talks about two tears, two twins, receiving love in doubles, two trees, two skies. The skies may be indifferent, but neither the poem's speaker nor her addressee are. The addressed you reminds her of the impossibility of evenness, that love will be divided, that you can't have your cake and eat it too. Barbara Browning, another connoisseur of sexy language, argues otherwise. Citing the cultural critic Lewis Hyde, she writes, "In the world of gift, you not only can have your cake and eat it too, you can't have your cake unless you eat it." For Hyde, that's the link between the redistribution of wealth and eros. To him, and to me, the beauty of the gift is that, like sex, it confounds our sense of what it means to give pleasure and receive it. The more you give, the more you have. In Lotterman's poem, the cake is halved. Halving your cake as evidence of pleasure in domestic measures and tan lines scrawled across your frosted hips, split in two even scenes of beauty with bouncers announcing the border. For Lotterman, feeling redistributes on the left, so that holidays on your hip are spent without gifts. Tan lines also leave traces of liminality on the body, announcing the border that can or cannot be crossed. What pierces the back and forth between twos, between mirrors, is the single silicone dome. The question is how to keep this in perspective, where the date points to myself, the erotic trespass, or the remembered scene at the airport, or either I or whatever this is inadmissible to that love, or what happens on each side of the border. But it's also intolerable to be admitted, or not to admit to it, the open concept honesty of first nights at sea, which might make you seasick, or maybe they won't because you're fluent in the language of floating, of swimming along with the fluency of decoys that don't get homesick. A decoy is a duck at sea. You better hold on to the railing. I squeezed my thighs tight so I wouldn't fall off. Holidays on hips are formally, acrobatically effective in their strong declaration in the face of doubt or objection. But like most protests, the bruise will drain and then return to stasis. The mind doth protest too much against the intensity of feeling. And isn't the hip holiday already a gift? Or does this nagging child also want memorabilia from the trip to the beaches on Bergen? When feeling redistributes on the left, it achieves greater social but not emotional equality. In Waves, Lotterman writes, most days I imagine myself wrapped around my mother's ankle, or one of several lesser proxies. Body parts and juices move from hip to lip to camembert, from parts to crushed particulars. Lotterman's poems reinvent the blazon-like poetic cataloguing. Repeatedly, the lover is inventoried with bellies, thighs, belly buttons. The limit case is inevitably your belly button. In mathematics, the limit case surfaces when one or more components of an object are at the maximum extent of their possible variation. In the philosophy of science, it refers to an earlier theory which becomes subsumed into a later, often broader theory. It's a special case of the generic theory. We usually read the specific for the generic to justify it, or we posit the exception. I'm not interested in drawing out the queer bits of Lotterman's poems to suggest that we must always read a writer who occupies a somewhat marginalized position through this marginalized identity. I want to talk about these poems' queerness because it gives me joy, and because my queer reading of these poems is conditioned by the queer context in which I encounter them. I felt and feel cushioned by Lotterman's words, how they hold me and have held me. But how not to psychoanalyze when you know the poet? Once we enter the realm of professionalized education, we are taught not to read for pleasure, but rather to subsume our pleasure into a sublimated critical distance, to historicize, to move away from straightforward value judgments. This becomes somewhat more complicated with contemporary work when we can actively shape not only the canon, but also contemporary debates and feelings. What are we reading for? And what would it mean to read along with the pleasure? Lotterman's poems lend themselves to being read to a lover as pleasurable prompts for seduction, which puts a different spin on the question of the avant-garde's often proclaimed desire for or lack of efficacy. Wendy's poems are very effective. Given they are queer and they've been put to the test in explicitly queer situations, we could say that they are therefore also socially effective, not just romantically. Are we allowed to read or use our friends in this way? We could call it a form of homage. That would be the conventional and academic framework. But I'm also making Lotterman's words mine by uttering them in a specific situation, which we could call a romantic situation. It's situational appropriation. It's the best kind of impersonation via poetic language. In a recent talk, Jonathan Flatley claimed prurience as a critical mood, a form of recognition of knowledge in queer readings. Flatley has written about the prurient as an important affect, specifically talking about Andy Warhol and Maggie Nelson. So we could also say that queer prurience is delightfully non-productive or non-reproductive. Writing specifically about Maggie Nelson's Argonauts, Flatley comments, quote, as a queer critical text, as a text about queer theory, the text is open to exciting its readers. It thinks its readers might want to be aroused in the midst of learning about queer theory, and that arousal might itself be a point of queer theory. But at some basic level, it is also a way of caring about her readers by trying to help them shift their mood, in part by showing us how queer theory helped her to awaken in her own world a new mood or mode of attunement, a new way of being with. Like Warhol, for Nelson, this is a way of being and helping us to be ablaze with our care, unquote. How do we write about fantasies in a poem? Is the critic supposed to translate and make explicit? Do I list suggestive words? Fist, mucus, on all fours? After all, the belly and the belly button often have directional force. They pull the speaker in all the cardinal directions. There's also a pull between mystery and revelation, something unspeakable and something that cannot yet be named. Now you kill the mystery between your belly and everything else. But only so much. There's still this issue of legibility, of reading signs, casting away doubt. I can't tell what the rivulets of impossibly soft access are saying, but I get it. There are ways of getting it that can't be articulated. There is a secret you don't yet know how to confess. Without fantasy, there would be no love. Love makes waves. A cliché is a cliché because it's so true it is embarrassing, excessive, inappropriate. Cliché is a term from printing. It's a plate with which to make copies, a decal. Most of us, given a choice between chaos and naming, between catastrophe and cliché, would choose naming. Most of us see this as a zero-sum game, as if there were no third place to be. Something without a name is commonly thought not to exist. And here's where we can discern the benevolence of translation. The double tilde in mathematics is the sign for almost equivalence, a mark of suspension, an approximation. Decals of love spit up the dial tone like nylon prayer flags. You constitute at least one remaining stanza of attachment, putting the lyric on pause with the ethical bedrock of debt. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Her legs upset you over and over again, a smooth olive tonic on the way to what you can't touch. I tried you back and got nothing but net worth, your mattress filled with camembert. I'm perfectly turned on and shut down by the repulsive taste of cream. For instance, your thigh rips open the seminal juice box, splashing face paint on the taboo of incest and sending my prize to the waiting room. Evening collects in the vending machines as the room somehow ricochets your mood. Hesitation escapes through a backdoor oasis in which nothing seems to matter as much as it does at home, or home seems to matter when you're gone. There is a line that can't be walked, from the streets to my desk where I saved your iridescent headshots in a set. A menagerie of chopsticks tests the tenderness of steaks not drawn to scale. The miracle is mediocre and rare, specifically yours and everyone's. It's exactly what it looks like. Most days I imagine myself wrapped around my mother's ankle, or one of several lesser proxies. Dreams downplay the balance of what can't be staged in life, where I imagine the force of synthesis to be stoppable by a single disposable contact lens placed on the tip of a penis, yours or mine. We keep switching places. How else to felonize the scoliosis of class, or have uncommon consequence in a zero-fault state? Very little happened in the time it took to pass from conditions of rain to snow. The sky opened up and watched us waste the day. A barely reflective stretch of cellophane takes your wavy portrait, but can't remember anything. It is exactly what it looks like. Our non-negotiables are fertilizer and an endlessly replicable nursery. Sometimes we have to put the lyric on pause. You put romantic exclamation on pause because perhaps you face an ethical dilemma, fighting over forbidden fruit, or in this case, cream. I gender the cream, the camembert, the juice box. I pretend to reread my Freud, my Melanie Klein, my Jacques Lacan, but what would they have to say to your fertilizer, your replicable nursery, this taboo of incest? Finally, I love my therapist more than any other man. As soon as this is true, it no longer needs to be. Transference is the redirection of feelings from childhood to a substitute, usually one's therapist, in stanzas of attachment. Or it's the transfer of one love object to another. Perhaps also here, it's the surface transfer initiated by the decals of love, tattooed into habit, the movement from surface to depth that the poem dramatizes. In your first draft of the poem, fertilizer was tracing paper, a material for replication, for tracing lines, for copying, for repeating. Her legs upset you over and over again. I see the commentary on warped social stratification, the scoliosis of class, the uncommon consequence in a zero-fault state, which rightly argue that the same rules don't apply to everyone. But I zero in on what I can't touch, on her legs upsetting you. Sometimes we have to put the lyric on pause in order to read what's actually there. And so I read this poem as if in erotic lockstep with the three seasons, or as the underbelly of the poem Tie. And then I learned that the poems aren't about that at all. You ask if this throws things. I say no, this is perfect. Having access to the poet's compositional motivations might throw you off, or it might throw into relief the workings of a poem in a new light. In cliché printing, there's a difference in level, which allows for the transfer. Either this makes me a bad reader or a good friend, not to encroach on the poem, or vice versa. A good reader but a bad friend not to have picked up on the biographical detail. Do poems want to be fully understood? I'm not completely wrong, it just turns out that the love is of a different kind, different register. The poem's subtext is a sick parent. Suddenly I noticed the mention of a catheter, the word recover, the waiting room, the question why does it hurt you to move? You add more keys to the Caribbean. You see, this is also a lecture about the situatedness of reading. Would I have read this poem differently in the library rather than in bed and with company? The order of reading matters too. Knowing that the poem's horses and sandals are about a particular lover, I chased the love trains of the other poems as well. I let myself be led in a particular direction, or rather, I leapt into that direction. I.A. Richards chides me, and the feelings that rush out may take a course that is only partially directed by the poem. We look for what we want to find, which is like love. Maybe we want all poems to be love poems. Maybe we want a poem to be the key to a new relationship or affair. Reading aloud or sending a poem as a gift is an incentive for love, the instigator of love. I revisited these poems for this lecture, and they hit me with all the force they did the first time I read them, but now couched in their specific romance, the specific inflection of their impact on my life. Enter Jonathan Flatley, reassuring the reader. It's entirely possible for a text to seem to have one mood or be about one mood, and yet produce a mood in its readers that is distinct. Enter Wendy, no more clues. Enter Diana Hamilton raising a toast. Quote, it's anti-intellectual to presume self-doubt means one hasn't thought hard enough. Everyone who's ever been smart at all, just like anyone who has ever really had faith in God or in love, is completely plagued by doubt. But still, I'm not sure the men watching know this, and I like to watch women be fucking masters of discourse. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know how to say this part, I have to return to the part of that phrase that troubled you if you listened carefully, and has troubled me since I was a child, in love with women, in hate with myself. I like to watch women, whether they're mastering their discourse or not, honestly. But mastery isn't an escape from the question of sexiness. It pairs really well, in fact, with tousled hair, unquote. Hamilton here gets at a conundrum of contemporary feminist and queer writing, or feminist and queer writing more broadly. There is both the desire to be accessible and boldly test the sponginess of explicitness, and foreground elements of identity in the body, or conversely, to embrace linguistic difficulty, obscurity, and abstraction. This has been an ongoing debate for the feminist avant-garde since at least the 1980s. Verity Spot illuminates both the pitfalls of this binary thinking or of the desire to make one's identity legible in Against Trans manifestos, quote, "The observable is tenuous." Description doesn't run along straight or clear lines. Caspar Heinemann argues, maybe sometimes all you can do is be the messy, incoherent first draft you want to see in the universe. Lotterman agrees. Now and then, portraits of young girls present two alternative futures in which I accept either the meltdown of mountaintop removal or the secondary embellishments of Jello. Lotterman here references the American coming-of-age buddy movie Now and Then. While the tomboy character flattens her chest with a bandage, her friend stuffs her brow with balloons filled with pudding. The choice is one of two extremes, to exaggerate and emphasize or to minimize and suppress, or less negatively, to offer a space of maintenance. But how do we undo the artificial and natural divide? I think Lotterman's poetry revels in a kind of wobbliness. This is also couched in the context of summer camp, which is referenced in a few poems throughout this work. A spatially and temporarily contained microcosm for sexual development and for social pressures to play themselves out. For Sarah Ahmed, bodies become straight by tending towards straight objects, such that they acquire their direction. The nearness of love objects is not casual. We do not just find objects there like that. The very requirement that the child follow a parental line puts some objects and not others into reach. Parental love is enormous and mistakenly cast as the foil to all future partners. The mountaintop removal perhaps also reveals something a little darker, ecological damage. At first glance, it seems like a more radical intervention in nature, but maybe the Jello just hides its terrible ethical footprint more sweetly in an artificially coloured guise, gelatin, etc. Sarah Ahmed again. Of course, when we inherit, we also inherit the proximity of certain objects as that which is available to us, as given within the family home. Objects and objectives, materials and values. Our non-negotiables are fertilizer and an endlessly replicable nursery. The construction also appears in a different poem as our non-negotiables are hardwood floors and strong family values. We inherit ways of inhabiting and extending into space, which shapes what's present. When Lotterman studied at Bard, she wrote a thesis titled Calligrams of Absence. What she says about Mallarmé could equally apply to her own work. The most honest testimony begins where it cannot be given. The poet's failure to forge a link between language, the self, and the world results in work that bears witness to these ruptures. And yet, the confluence between the disruption of the poetic form and the poet's own adversity ultimately manages to create another link, as the poetry participates in the same conflicts experienced by the poet. The language points to what it cannot articulate by revealing the instances of its own failure, which we might call queer. To substitute an absence, sub as verb and prefix appear frequently in Lotterman's poems. Animated by right to smaller worlds, your knees sub in for the breeze. Learning love on dummies with dad is the ruse of all workable substitutions. But also, in place of you, nothing. Substitution isn't so easy after all. The lover is irreplaceable. There is a stage at which the world empties out every proper noun and you, specifically you, sub in as the tailored fulfillment of what life would like to bat next. To sub is also to submit. It's been so long since I had sex the way I wanted, except that yesterday I did, only after identifying the unquestionable ripple and then submitting to the fortress of a fluke. I end with a Gettier, in which stimulation is an accident of my low threshold for pleasure. The Gettier problem tests our understanding of propositional knowledge. Justified beliefs based on sensory data might feel absolutely true or are true by sheer luck, and thus trouble what we understand to constitute knowledge. Somewhere in the middle of all this, there is a timeline of fungible love in which I forgot to say that I couldn't come home on half days to find the light of two perverted sons doing sex things on the bed, since the golf balls in my wallet cannot feel or be felt. I think again of the ingress and how the sun makes an ingress into the cardinal signs at equinoxes and solstices. Life is a bottom, but sometimes we find bottoms subtending tops, straight lines joined at a point, or a bract extending under a flower to support and enfold it. Perhaps I'm also reading you for a theory of love. I get on the couch with no intention to be legible. We meet in a new scene of reading, where dawns of disco reflect the one true imposter of equestrian sovereignty in the corroded body of water. That gallop is you. The lover is a contradiction in terms, the one true imposter, but like the carotid arteries are the main vessel that supplies the head with blood. Roland Barthes writes in A Lover's Discourse in a chapter on silence titled No Answer, the amorous subject suffers anxiety because the loved object replies scantily or not at all. And then adds in parentheses, like a bad concert hall, affective space contains dead spots where the sound fails to circulate. The perfect interlocutor, the friend, is he not the one who constructs around you the greatest possible resonance? Cannot friendship be defined as a space with total sonority, unquote. We give each other total sonority, tonal sorority. We call each other honey to feel held. We affirm our desires and encourage each other to pursue them. We comment on the vertiginous vernality of the affair, talk about metaphorical proposals, taking the tiniest of risks to test the waters. Massaging balm into the desert's cracking theme, you get wet, restless, head by the belly. In the dim-lit violet fish shack, we remain, for that moment, explicit. And we refuse the accurate adjectives. Who cares what restless could actually mean? The prettier words get at the underside of things, a different form of truth. Or maybe their surface sheen is just camouflage, which, when pierced, reveals their utter correctness, which you call overkill and I poetry. Does a love poem depend on the candid or on the candy, another decoy? Our snack municipality is sweet and plainly impossible. Perhaps our true task is to study the supple science of a sweet indentured future, where a gesture systematically melts you. But explicitness is foreclosed because that would force a decision, an action. True correlation becomes not really possible. Bottoms obtaining tops, or the opposite, but not at once. Lips collapse into access without accent, siren of a superintended pleasure. Pleasure lives forever in that cognate promise. Let's try not to accelerate things. Decisions make you tired, but so does not acting. Feelings take up mental space, an amorphous and non-coherent mesh. You can't articulate them. As Lisa Robertson sighs in her Magenta Soul Whip, utopia is so emotional. I still see you lounging on the floor at La Mama Galleria in New York as Karl Marx, as lapdog in my play, asking me and the audience, what's up? Sometimes we write lines already hearing, imagining others saying them, thus writing an address without knowing it. In an interview with Natalie Albert for the Atlas Review, you say, if I get any thrill from people reading me, it's probably secondary to an immediate blush, or maybe it's thanks to it. As soon as I reveal something, there's an impulse to kick dirt back into the hole I just dug. But then there's also a competing excitement associated with the reveal. And even though I say competing, I think shame and thrill escalate together. Which makes me think of projections and polarities and Philip Sidney, who knew about both. As he puts it in Astrophil and Stella, from whose rule who do swerve, rebels to nature, strive for their own smart. It is most true what we call Cupid's dart, and images which for ourselves we carve. I think we all want others to usher us into the light, but I kind of admire people who are like, fuck it, I'm not only going to push the Ouija board, i.e. me, but allow others to see me push it without shame. Your love is also yours. You can own your desire, but does own imply ownership? And isn't that too simple, too much like self-help? Indirectly and inadvertently, these texts teach us, without necessarily realizing that proposition themselves, their strength in expressing desire and asking for things. And so in these poems, just as in real life, time passes and new guests, new lovers arrive. I can't keep the rhythm, baby. I can't make you representative, Wendy, of contemporary queer love poetry, of the contemporary of queerness, of poetry, of love, and yet I've chosen you specifically, to be the paragon of our generation. We still don't know exactly how the roads work, but it's okay. Admonishing all lovers, Berlant writes, but we have already seen that your desire does not take you to its predestined object, the thing that will repair the trauma of maternal separation, of sexual difference, that set you on your voyage in the first place. Desire is practical. It takes what it can get. Desire has bad eyesight, as it were. Remember that the object is not a thing, but a cluster of phantasmic investments in a scene that represents itself as offering some traction, not a solution to the irreparable contradictions of desire. Or maybe desire has great eyesight thanks to the proxy of the rosy tint, but has burned its tongue from a scalding liquid, drunk too fast. I still have a small but visible scar from a tray of burnt nuts on my left hand from that first night in Crown Heights with a rekindled romance of remainders that didn't add up. I don't need to analyze this. It's so overdetermined. The bellies in the stadium collectively spell what you already know, that our pre-symbolic crushing is extinct and is the only thing worth saving. In the interview mentioned earlier, Lotterman continues, one more thing while we're on the lyric. Some of my favorite poets offer these sprawling panoramic views of cultural forces in intricate collision. Their poetry draws back to reveal the big picture of our time and place, like some fabulous glitchy erector set, too big to comprehend from within. I mostly don't do that. I go in. It's like that Eames movie Powers of 10, that zooms away from a couple lazing in a patch of grass in Chicago by powers of 10 until our view is supergalactic, and then zooms back into the man until our view is subcellular. When you zoom into an individual, or in the case of the lyric, the self, the subject becomes the panoramic, its own index of bigger forces, a complicated repository of an overdetermined I whose concerns are the sound of these forces clamoring. So I don't think expansive poems are disengaged with subjectivity, and I don't think lyrical poems are unexpansive. You go in. In love, you have to go in. Then follows the realization that we have already said it all, in this or that text, to this or that lover. It's a frustration that we cannot get over. My attempts to enter are redirected into a growing portrait of increasing blurriness. The roof of the building becomes the Tetris of my wet desperation. Privacy is a real thing, I guess, too firm to be crushed by the waves of my soggy, ambient love. I have already written this poem. There are some poets who essentially write one long poem no matter what they write. In other words, they continue the thinking begun in one poem. They wrestle with one question. They write in one vein, in one tonal constellation. I think Wendy Lotterman's work is like that. Each poem is still distinct in that it broaches on the surface different topics or is shot into focus by some experience. But ultimately, it's an extended thinking into verse, spread out across her poems. I have trouble getting into short, punchliney poems. That sort of deadpan, monochromatic sincerity doesn't bowl me over. And of course, I want to be. What does it mean for a poem to bowl you over? Work that creates that kind of fabulous combustion of thought that leaves me both winded and grateful. In a feminist reading of Diotima's speech in Plato's Symposium, Luce Irigaray concludes her analysis like this, quote, "Neither the good, nor the true, nor justice, nor the government of the city would occur without beauty. And its strongest ally is love. Love therefore deserves to be venerated. And Diotima asks that her words be considered as a celebration and praise of love. What she proposes to contemplate, beauty itself, is understood as that which confuses the opposition between immanence and transcendence, an always already sensible horizon at the depths of which everything would appear. But it would be necessary to go back over the whole speech again to discover it in its enchantment." Unquote. Dear Wendy, yes to feelings as guests that one can properly address. It's something that I think you are very good at in your poetry. Each poem showcases its own victory of the particular. I especially like the new one you sent. I keep thinking about the choice you set up between the meltdown of mountaintop removal or the secondary embellishments of Jello. Both feel momentous but also wobbly from tremoring because of the L and M sounds. I think there's something incredibly seductive in your style, the suggestion of intimacy that is also partially semantic, the revelation of some secret under various layers of associative textual density, or a kind of argumentative logic that only really works in poems or in dreams. Your poems often read themselves, psychoanalyze themselves, and place symbolic footholds or hooks along the way, which do not connect to a consistent metaphoric architecture, and that's nice. I love reading these poems as a way of thinking through something. It's seriously good poetic thinking that happens in poems because of their prosody, their structure, their metaphoricity and intensity. I also think your poems are instructive, but in an indirect way. Neither their instructions nor their poetic arguments are reducible to one statement. They're also just fun. I will have to think on it some more. I'd love to write about it sometime. Love, Sophie. Thank you.
Over here, a little bit far away, but it's a big space. Amazing. Thank you so much, Sophie, for this rich, risky, thrilling lyric lecture, this too close reading, which I felt really helped us to think through new ways of approaching love, queerness, and I suppose criticality. And I think what's so exciting as well is to think about how this work, which I know has, I suppose, also been iterative, might invite responses again, and that feels really kind of in keeping with the sensibility of this dialogue between you and Wendy. We've got around half an hour for questions and conversations before we can go through to the research forum for a glass of wine. So I'll let you kind of like process, and I'll open with a question for Sophie, which can hopefully open up an interesting conversation. So you mentioned in your intro to the lecture the kind of the definition of this being a lyric lecture, and we see that in the naming in the title, which I thought was interesting to think about also in relationship to the Anne Carson quote that you brought up around naming and translation. But I was wondering if you could perhaps speak a little bit more about how you kind of approach or define this difference between the lyric lecture and the lecture performance, which is so kind of important to your practice, and maybe kind of also in addition to that, because I also, perhaps the role of the performative in this work, and in it as a kind of a genre, I suppose.
Yeah, I was really interested in thinking about how can I was confronted with this question of like, how do I read this work that's been meaningful to me, but also that has, as I say in the lecture, I've read or I've made mine or I've kind of read out loud so many times, but then also how do you read the work of a friend of yours? So I was just confronted with this question of, you know, what does reading mean, and a kind of critical writing as a form of reading. And I also feel that often in critical essays, we use quotations as a kind of backup dancers, you know, so they kind of, you know, they don't really get center stage because they're only there to provide evidence or to show that, you know, we know what we're talking about, here's the example, or, you know, when we analyze a poem, this is the poem, now I'm going to say what it means. And so I was just interested in how could we mix that up a little bit and create this sort of, have the poem actually respond to me or be the answer itself, or maybe it's an oblique answer as well, or actually speak back to me and or perform with me and actually be in dialogue with me. And I also try to resist, obviously I do analyze the poems, but again, I think that's complicated by the fact that poems themselves, analyze themselves as well often. So allowing maybe these sort of failures of reading, the confusions, the detours, and also I think to allow space for a kind of pleasure of listening. And of course, again, we go maybe to poetry readings and we listen to poems, but I wondered if we could, you know, how could I introduce some of that pleasure of listening into the writing? And I think that's, I called it a lyric lecture sort of, rather than, you know, a lecture performance. I thought a lot about the lecture performance. If I were to do this as a lecture performance, I would, you know, I would do so, there would be some movement. I'm not saying that every single lecture performance needs to have movement, but I generally think that lecture performances might either use some kind of choreography interaction with objects, or maybe costumes, or some visual material. I was, again, I think with like a lyric lecture, I wanted it to be very sonic and also text-based, so no kind of fanfare, no nothing kind of glamorous in terms of like visual stimuli, just the text, you know, and what does the text do? How does that resonate with us? Again, to avoid maybe trying to illustrate too much. So I think in a lecture performance, in lecture performances that I've done, I'm really interested in moving between different modes of knowing, you know, maybe embodied forms of knowing, or kind of material senses of knowing. Yeah. So I think that's how I would distinguish the lyric lecture and the lecture performance. By the way, I just noticed, do we need to speak into the mic for the digital audience? No?
Should I take? I can take the.
Yeah.
I just know. No, I don't know. I just remembered that we.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, that's so interesting, and I'm also, I think, getting to the heart of it has been sort of, like kind of, so almost, you know, so boldly text-based as well, and how I felt that really manifested in the way in which it's. We also have this sense of it's the relay of which your voice and Wendy's voice and these two different kinds of voices kind of like almost speaking through you in this moment here in this really live performative way. Does anyone have any other questions or insights? Yes. Thanks.
Also, where's the camera? Where's the camera for the live? Is it this one? Okay, yeah. Yeah. No, I didn't mean. I was just curious because there's obviously this hot time here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really amazing. And I just was sort of thinking about, you know, you set up this kind of history of literary analysis, right, between like surface reading and critique reading or reparative reading. And I guess I was just thinking, you know, because there's so much antagonism between these. What are becoming increasingly camps. So many types of suspicion, critique, and then this sort of pleasure of surface and possibility of plurimperative, and then like whole, banks of kind of writing that theorizes and rethinks relationality. And I'm really interested because I felt like maybe you were actually sort of synthesizing some close reading and, with the, admonishing I. Richards quote, but still kind of part of the text, right? And I felt like the close reading was actually being surfaced or something. I don't quite know what metaphor is, but the kind of surface depth didn't feel like it was contradictory. And I just wanted to, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, thank you. That's such a great question because I've obviously been reared on close reading. Really, this is my, in a way, that's my go-to mode. And I also think that close reading can be, incredibly pleasurable. And I think and can offer, forms of, I think you're right, I think it's a synthesis of a form of critique that also revels in the surface, in the pleasure, in the mistakes, in the confusion, in the self-reflection as well. Or, because I think if I were to do a proper close reading, I would try to arrive at some kind of argument. Which I tried to, refrain from, to see, where that would lead me, to allow myself not to actually boil down a kind of the complexity of the work, and also my actual kind of misunderstanding of a lot of the work. Even if you could say, like, I understand a lot of the work, there are all these, often we're not even allowed to say that we maybe misunderstand something, we misread something, or we read it so subjectively, because it's, we wanted to read it that way. So, and to kind of, to allow that. Yeah, I think I was less interested in sort of, I'm not interested in taking any sides, just to kind of see, like, what are the kind of forms of reading that we could experiment with. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I need to think about it a little bit more, how I would, I think close reading is I think I said this in my description, it's almost like it's a too close reading, it's a bit too close. And then again, like what does that, how does that feel? Also it's interesting actually, because when I first delivered this as a lecture, I delivered it to students in a particular version, and I was very aware of thinking about this, what happens to this in a pedagogical context, when I present this, and what kind of permission do I give myself, so to speak like that or to do that when, again, I've been probably also taught, well, first of all, not to even acknowledge, myself, but then also to maybe teach students to do proper close readings, that are rooted in the text, where, you find evidence. Yeah.
This might sound like nonsense, because it's sort of just like an initial kind of, I don't really know how to articulate it. But I'm interested in something that came up in one of the lines, which is this can and can't go on forever. But I'm interested in the idea of close reading as also never letting go, and also not knowing when to let go. And I think as also a close reader, like someone even like we do my fellowship, I did my fellowship was a close reading in one word, for 3 years. Like, so this idea of being dysfunctional reading as well.
Yeah.
And I love seeing you describe that as infatuation, because I've often thought about it more as neurotic.
But I agree.
But in a positive way as well. So, I love the balance that you had with never letting go of the poem, but also asking the poem, never let me go.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on, is there a place in any of this for an invite to let go as well? Can you let go with the poem? I don't know, what would that mean? Is it useful as a thought?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, beautiful comment. I think this is really interesting. Whether this is it dysfunctional, or is it just a different way of functioning? Yeah, I think that's really interesting. how long could you go on for with this? I mean, what could you but maybe I think this goes back to something we talked about in the workshop, thinking about the malleability of material, the malleability of language. Maybe I also would like to move to a form of criticism where you could return to works, and then generally not just in the sense of referring back to something you've done, and but actually rewriting something, or keeping large chunks of something but just adding a little bit, or taking large chunks of something you've written and just putting it somewhere else and doing something else with it, and continuing this practice of reading. So I'm just interested, so almost like also close reading your own work, and because we also tend to think of, well, now we've published something, we've written something, and it's done, and we move on. But I'm often haunted by just sentences, and they might be other people's words, but sometimes they're also my own words, something I've been thinking about, and I can't get out of my head, and maybe I feel like I've resolved it, but actually I haven't resolved it, and so it comes back to me. So, yeah, I think this is a really beautiful image of this question of let me go, don't let me go, holding on, letting go. Thank you, Amy.
Well, thank you so much, Sophie. There's just so much response, isn't there? I'm sure everyone has so much to respond to, and I mean, I don't know if I've kind of formed a lot of my responses yet, but one thing I was thinking when you were talking about this kind of extraordinary kind of intensity between two, and then opening it out with all the correspondences of others and quotations coming in, and I guess the kind of places that this intense relationship of two takes you to, with these other bodies, and then who gets enfolded in the work. And then and from that, and from seeing that kind of played out, and from listening to it in the air, I was thinking, do you know anyone, or is there anyone you know who is a too close reader as well of this work, of Wendy's work?
Of Wendy's work?
Yeah, because actually I was thinking there's also something, and I think this is so interesting, and you touched on it a few times about I love you also as a kind of claiming, as a kind of taking, as a way of taking ownership and even making something one's property. I'm even really aware of it sometimes when I say it, like, in a group, it's like, I love that. And it's almost like you've taken it first. And so I was interested in this, in this relationship, which is intense, it is intimate, and it's focused and dedicated. If there's anyone else who you can talk with about this work in such a deep way.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I should maybe ask Wendy. I mean, I don't know. I mean, hopefully at some point, maybe I hope, that more people would write about her work. But I think what's also interesting is maybe that, I don't even know how to say this, but I'm not even sure if I would want to talk about it with anyone else, because I think part of it is also just like, I'm also, obviously, clearly I did this for myself, obviously I wrote this now also probably like, oh my God, the pandemic has like expanded, 3 years ago or something, or 4 years ago. So, also this is why it's really interesting for me to return to this material. And I think even when I wrote the essay, that was after I had already given the lecture. So again, what happens in this time in between? I mean, I'd love to return to this and think about this, or write like a response now almost, But I don't know if I would want to, because sometimes you're interested in another writer or artist and you want to share that with other people, but sometimes as you said, we want to own it.
Yeah.
And I think it becomes a little bit perverse because she's also my friend, But the poems are different. Because I play with this a little bit by sometimes addressing her and sometimes addressing the poems. But there's definitely also something fictional because, there's a big fictional element there.
Because I think it's kind of bold and brilliant to say, actually, I want this to be about my reading that does have other resonances and other people can be involved in having done your workshop was brilliant. It's so obvious that there's a kind of ethos of generosity in your work, so it's not kind of closing down and no one's but it's that tension that I just think you hold so kind of I was going to say expertly, and I know that's such an odd word to use, but so carefully, as you also split the word earlier. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I do think that there's something, yeah, I'm really interested in, how can criticism be generous rather than combative, which is something we also talked about in the workshop. Yeah, definitely.
I might add to that if that's okay. Perhaps, yeah, just building on that comment around perhaps the role of the copy in this work, and how that connects with this, like, with the affects of love that are kind of like particularly kind of, that's the undercurrent to this. It's also the methodology for this. And I was just wondering what role the copy plays, and in the ways in which we see the poems often in their entirety. And are they the decals? Is this,
That's really interesting. And I was, again, I think there's something, love is very excessive. And so I was interested in, giving this, being excessive and this, having an excessive citational style, an abundant, excessive citational style. Copying. We talked about this in the workshop as well, I think, as something also kind of embodied, that you write something out over and over again by hand or by typing it to commit it to memory, but to through this kind of movement, whatever the movement is, right? To kind of to bring it sort of from the outside into your body somehow, into your mind and memory. So I think maybe the poems. That's a really good question. If the poems are the decals, I mean, I'm just interested in what leaves an imprint or trace. I don't think maybe the poems are the kind of the material, but then what they leave on me or on the surface is something that exceeds them. Yeah. So the decal also, if we think of like stickers or like, sort of these kind of like cheap tattoos, right, that you can have, they're not necessarily clean or neat. Yeah, there's always like maybe a little like patch of color is missing, or the edges are a bit blurry.
Yeah.
Or the other thing I'm really interested in is the more you copy something, the less distinct it will become, or less visible it will become. It will, the ink, if you use like a stamp or whatever it is, even in printing, let's say mimeograph printing, you print, at some point the ink will run out, and you will see that.
It was just it takes it beyond the legible in that way, which seems to also speak to the ways in which Wendy in her work is thinking about queerness.
Yeah, but also maybe it's about it shows the process of how it's made, and maybe often in, I don't know, but in maybe critical thinking, again, this is not something we don't necessarily show the process. I think again, artists do this a lot. As an artist, I would maybe talk about process a lot, but how do you, as a critical writer or thinker, how do I think about actually show the process as well? So maybe that's also where the decal comes in.
Because there feels something really compositional about this writing, the ways in which it's put together. It does. It really speaks to process to me.
Yeah, I should also say, so this was published in a really wonderful new journal called Manifold Experimental Criticism by Emma Gomez, who actually couldn't be here unfortunately today, but would recommend it to anyone to look it up, and kind of really interested in different forms, of criticism, of scholarship. And in terms of the layout, I think I really liked what they did with that also in terms of the design. Obviously this is, I've just had not even all of the citations, but again, thinking also through typography or layout, there's so much you can do in thinking about how these voices appear and how they're marked as I was going to say translations, but as quotations. Yeah.
I was just thinking about the character. Well, I was thinking about Chris Kraus and the way in I Love Dick she writes to Dick, and I guess it's like unrequited love, and he eventually kind of gets her letters and is kind of totally freaked out by them, and but there's this sort of persistence to Chris Kraus in the way that she continues writing to him and kind of gets obsessed by him, and even talks about having had conceptual sex with him, and of course it's it's very different, and you're talking about friendship, and you're kind of having this kind of loving relationship with this poem by a friend. But I was just thinking about like the difference between like writing to someone who you know, who's a friend, and then having this like maybe citational kind of practice where you like maybe write with people you've never met, and what, I don't know, just thinking about what that difference is, and like what's possible in that difference.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's I didn't, obviously sometimes there are some direct quotations from correspondence, but otherwise I didn't tell Wendy I was writing about these poems, or I didn't tell her that I was reading these to a lover, and saying like, I mean, I told her maybe after, but it's sort of, there's also something about that these texts, even though I have a friend with friends, there's this friendship, the texts become something else, once they appear in a different context. But again, going back to something we also discussed in the workshop, I think there are maybe different responsibilities, so towards contemporary writers compared to when I did this Enlightenment translation project or imaginary conversation project. I feel no obligation towards Diderot, but I feel, of course, a sense of responsibility, obligation towards Wendy. But yeah, I think it's, I think you could definitely do something very similar with like writers and artists you don't know, and even contemporary writers. I think it'd be fascinating. I think it always will bring up different aesthetic, but maybe also ethical questions, like, can I do this, or how? And this is not a legal question. Is like, can I? But a kind of an interesting question about actually how we think about maybe language and ownership more broadly, or like how we treat other voices and other materials. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I just sort of building on that, I was really interested because obviously the affect here is love and friendship, and I mean, even like love Sophie is what's left on the screen. What would it be like to do this with a poet who bored you, or you hated, or like something where the kind of affect and the work of that affect is completely different? Like this kind of approach, does it work if you aren't invested in the same way in the thing that you're talking about?
Yeah. That's a really good question. Yeah, I think it would also work, and I think it would be really fascinating, and maybe I will do that now because you've inspired me to do that. Yeah, I think what would probably happen would be, I imagine, given that I like to play with language, or probably take pleasure in that play with it, it would probably be hard for me not to enjoy it, even if I don't enjoy the work. So, because if I gave myself the license to do something with that boring, or just like boring work, or disagreeable work, it would probably end up being different. But it's a good experiment. I really like that suggestion. Because the question is then, if it becomes fun for me, I think the other question is then, is it also fun for a reader, for a listener, or is that similar? Would it be boring and disagreeable if this kind of chain of chain reaction, I suppose, of affect? But I think this is also something I'm also acknowledging in a way, like it's also, it could be that, I mean, or like I have this quote obviously from Richards, you know, you know, I mean, so what that I think we can't control the kinds of feelings that a poem produces, or that it can be very unexpected and surprising actually what that is. And in a way, I did encounter that with the Enlightenment project. You know, that I did actually think that it would be more kind of, I don't know what the affect would be like. I felt I was going to be more confrontational, or, you know, would reject the language or the ideas. And maybe in a way I did reject the ideas, but in other ways I also took immense pleasure in saying things I wouldn't actually say, and I could do that because I turned them into plays. And you have characters, and so I can just say this character is now going to say this. And I can also perform it because it's not me, and it doesn't matter if I say something that's a little bit stupid or outrageous or, you know, outmoded, outlandish. And so I think that's, yeah. Thank you, Rachel. Shall we
call it a day? Yes. Thank you so much, Sophie. It was absolutely incredible and a really, really interesting conversation. Yeah, thank you so much. If you'd like to, we can head on up to the research forum for a glass of wine if you can join us. That's just up one floor. Thank you.
Thank you.